Hello there. Happy New Year's. If I look sleep deprived or if you hear explosions, I'm not under siege for my crimes in Colombia. It's just New Year's was a few days away, so there might still be fireworks. You can do a lot of stuff in a laboratory. You can test how medicine influences the activity of genes or of proteins. You can test the death of cells. You can test the death of organism based on how much of a medicine is used. Or you can test how the systems inside an organism just grow and develop over time. You can test a lot of different stuff in a lab basically. And to test this, of course, you're going to need some living organism or part of a living organism. And because it's going to be very difficult to do these kinds of tests on a pile of sugar or something like that. To do these tests, these organisms may have different levels of complexity. And today I'm going to talk about a few of the most common animals that are used in laboratory. The most simple and common organism in genetics is Escherichia coli or E. coli, a bacteria. It's basically just a bag of protein with one big chromosome, a few smaller bits and parts of DNA. Doesn't really have very much complexity in it. You can say that a virus is less complex, but a virus is kinda alive, kinda not alive, so let's not talk about that. E. coli has its entire genome just described and pretty much out there, and we know everything and how everything works. So it's a very easy organism to work with that way, because if you mutate, you know exactly what's going on, what's changing. You don't have to worry that much about discovering something new by accident. There are thousands of different variations of this bacteria, and you can buy all kinds that can survive all kinds of different antibiotics or different kinds of poison. They can make medicine. Like all organisms on this list, they will develop very quickly, they will grow very easily, they'll be easily housed, they're not going to be very expensive. So they're just a very simple and cheap organism to work with, which is why they're very, very popular. So now the next step up from just a bag with some liquid and protein and a bit of DNA here and there would be to have a cell that's eukaryotic. So it would have a nucleus, it would be just in general more complex, maybe a few mitochondria even, if you're feeling very fancy. Next step up would be something like yeast. Yeast does not have just one chromosome, it has multiple, just like you and me. At least if you're watching this, I hope you have more than one chromosome. It's a little bit more complex, but it's still just one cell. So the next step up would be a kind of small worm or nematode called Caenorhabditis elegans. I hope I pronounced that correct, just like with everything that's Latin. As I said, it's just a small worm. They can be either 959 cells big or 1033, depending on if it's a male or if it's both male and female. Scientists have basically mapped out every single cell and how it develops in the organism, when it will die off to make space, and when it will divide in order to make new cells. Everything like that's already been laid out, which sounds very interesting, but also like very tedious work. So respect to those people who had to do that. But of course, a little worm looks nothing like a human. So the next step up would be something with maybe eyes, legs, maybe a bit bigger that you can actually see it with the naked eye. Well, that would be Drosophila melanogaster, or the fruit fly. It has been used to study biology since 1900 or something like that, and it's very easy to distinguish the males from the females. They're once again very cheap to house, cheap to buy. Once you buy the equipment, you can use it for years and years, so it's not something that you just have to buy and then throw it out like some kind of clothing from H&M or something. The genetics are very interesting, as their DNA in some cells form these kinds of puffs where certain parts of active DNA will be transcribed and translated a lot, and even parts of it will be duplicated. So you will just have these normal chromosomes and then some buffs here and there of just very active protein transcription. So then a lot of those proteins will be found even more in those cells, which is very interesting to say the least. Maybe it isn't, sorry. The DNA also is very well known as in how it develops in just larvae, but I'm not going to go into that. But But you can use it to grow things like eyes on knees or legs on heads. Those are all things that have been done, and it looks pretty freaky. But the problem is, most of us humans cannot fly, and most of us hopefully have a spine. So what is cheap, easy, and quickly reproduces that has a spine but is still very small and can be tested on? Well, that would be the zebrafish. There are even mutated versions of the zebrafish that will glow in the dark when they are put under a certain light, and those are called glowfish. I'm sure there are also other fish that you can do that with, but zebrafish were the first and I like them. You can also use them to track how the brain develops. You can track the calcium when certain parts of the brain will have higher amounts of calcium, depending on where some kind of bit of food is and how they react to pain and stuff like that. You can look at how nervous system will grow in the hatchlings. Is that the right word? Hatchling? I don't know. But of course, we don't live underwater. We have lungs and we're mammals. So the next model of animal that will be used, and also is pretty much the final model, would be the mouse. Mice are very closely related to humans when it comes to our physiology and everything. We have pretty much the same organs and the same rough build compared to the previous organisms, but they're just, once again, very small, easy to house, cheap, reproduce quite quickly, so that's neat. It's also impossible to do some tests on humans, and often also illegal. So that's why mice can be used, for example, tests on medicine, how it behaves in the brain. Even if someone was to give consent, you cannot do that stuff on a person. So that's when you have to use mice to make a model, so you're sure that once something comes into the brain, it behaves how you want it to behave. Mice are not perfect, however. For example, the liver of the mouse is slightly different than that of human. If you have any kind of medication and you put it on the market, about 1 in 10,000 people will react to it in a certain, well, it's a very random way, but it will be very toxic to those people. And quite often it will be very toxic to the liver. And mice don't have that for some reason. Only humans tend to have that 1 in 10,000 chance that you overly react to that. So you cannot test for that on mice. And also it's not common enough to test with those medicines on people, because 1 in 10,000 is extremely rare. And once again, you cannot predict it when someone has it. Sorry mice, you're not perfect. There are of course other mammals that you can use, such as rats, rabbits, guinea pigs. NASA was very fond of using monkeys. The Russians were very fond of using dogs, but they're pretty much just bigger models of mice once you get into biology. There's not really that much of a step up in difference from E. coli to yeast to small nematode to fly to zebrafish to mouse. Once you get to like from mouse to cat or dog or whatever, it's just not that much of a difference, and mice are just very cheap and small. But anyways, that was just a little rant. I hope you learned something, or at least enjoyed yourself.